picture to be. If you're happy for your image to be in the recording, then yeah, this is just for us to be mindful that we're going to be recording the meeting. So I'm going now to pass on to our speaker. Thank you so much, Karoline, for joining us. You shared with us, it was a very busy time with the start of a new position, so we really appreciate you being with us. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm just going to share my screen to show you the presentation. All right, I think you should all be seeing this now. Yeah. Okay, so I prepared like a talk for like 40 minutes and then I'm looking forward to the discussion. Yeah, so again, thank you very much for the invitation and the interest in our work. I have to say this is not like my main work on my that I did in my dissertation, but it's actually kind of a side project that came up together with 3 other colleagues. So as you know, what I'm going to present is a paper that we've published in Gaia, Can Liberal Democracies Thrive with Consumption Limits, Barriers to Implementing Consumption Corridors. And I've worked on that paper, not on my own, but together with Margaret Hadra from Vienna. She's now at Vienna University of Technology. Daniel Hausknoss, who's just as me at the Institute of Social Change and Sustainability. And Michael de Florian, who is unfortunately not in academia anymore, but he's now head of the Office for Climate Neutral City of Innsbruck, so that's fine too. And what I would like today to what I would like to do today is first of all present our research perspective, because what we have experienced is that sometimes also the approach of our paper was a bit provocative for some proponents of the consumption corridors literature. So yeah, I'm also very interested in why you decided to approach us, or me in this case, to present and discuss it with you, and how you take the paper. So that's also something that we're very interested in, and I'm always going to talk about we and us, because it's of course not the work, it's no work I did on my own. So this is the first thing that I'm going to do, and this will be followed by an introduction to the literature of consumption corridors and liberal democracy. Although I'm sure that you are very familiar with the consumption corridors literature, but I still decided to do it just that everybody's on the same page. And then we will look at 3 barriers between the idea of consumption corridors and structural features of liberal democracy that we have addressed in our paper. And in each case of the barrier, we adopt a different analytical perspective. And for each barrier, what we did is looking at an argument from the literature on consumption corridors and try to unpack it in kind of a field of tension, which is that we agree on the argument that is made. However, we always add a but to it and say that we would like to delve a bit deeper into objections that may arise from consumption corridors. And these different analytical approaches, paths include, first of all, a political economy perspective on how social conflicts are actually pacified in liberal democracies. The second lens is a subject theoretical perspective on understandings of freedom and autonomy, first of all, of autonomy in Western and liberal contemporary societies. And third, a systemic perspective on how liberal democracies stabilize themselves, that is, on which sources of legitimacy they are based. And of course, then I would draw a conclusion from that. So let's get started with the research perspective of our team of authors. So we were united by the fact that we have all worked together.
Karoline, apologies if I interrupt you. We're not sure if the slides are moving or if we cannot see them. We're still stuck on the first slide.
Okay, because in my case, it is moving. Okay, so that's a pity, of course. I'm just going to stop the try again. But thank you very much for mentioning that, because. And now?
Yes, now we see the plan. Okay, yes.
Okay, so that's just what I did. Yeah. It
Thank
didn't
you.
miss too much yet, except for that. Okay, but thank you very much for mentioning it. Okay, so let's get started with the research perspective. Yeah, we were all united by the fact that we were working together for quite some time at the Institute for Social Change and Sustainability in Vienna. And as I said, half of us, like Daniel and me, still do. And one can say that within critical sustainable research, the IGN perspective belongs to the reflexive observational strand of social critical sustainability research. So what does that mean? Karl Brandt has put it that way, that it is a social scientific observation and empirical analysis of social sustainability processes, their consequences and contradictions. And this means that we are, what actually our institute has been done a lot is asking for this, like a term that the professor of my institute, Ingo Verblüdern, has coined, asking for the sustained unsustainability in Western liberal democracies. And so the book is in German, so I have to translate it for you. It says sustained unsustainability, why the ecological transformation of society is not happening. And therefore, we're also an interdisciplinary team working on different perspectives. So some people, or one person worked, like Daniel works on the state, other people have worked on parties, social movements, the subject, etc. So that's actually kind of what unites us, is like this perspective on why the profound socio-ecological transformation is actually not happening. And what we've also done is then also dealing in a constructively but also critical way, for example, with transformative proposals from critical sustainability research, which provokes maybe sometimes some misunderstanding, but maybe also sometimes some really interesting discussions. So, and we do not do that because we do not share the concerns of a socio-ecological transformation in the sense of social limits, societal limits that should be placed within planetary boundaries. So on the contrary, we very much agree from a purely normative perspective that this would be like the just way of dealing with the social ecological crisis. However, we follow the approach that only what has been understood can be changed, and therefore always ask again in a constructive sense about the barriers of certain transformative proposals. Because maybe also according to a provocative thesis, if we do not ask about these hurdles and those fuel hopes for a normatively desirable future, this can also lead us running blindly into a regressive future, right? So this is kind of like the aim, to further understand the hurdles of why something might not come up as hoped or suggested. Okay, but let's start from the beginning. What do consumption corridors mean? The concept of consumption corridors has gained popularity in critical sustainability research against the backdrop of the worsening social ecological crisis, which is often defined in terms of transgressing planetary boundaries. The basic assumption here is that societal boundaries should be set within planetary boundaries, as also Brandt et al. Have argued. And that is to enable a good life for all, in which many should no longer live at the expense of others, but in which the universal needs of all can be met, although in culturally different ways. So here, social boundaries should be designed in such a way that they contribute to individual and social well-being. And here, well-being is not understood in the hedonistic approach, which is more a subjective approach to maximizing happiness and life satisfaction, but well-being is pursued with the eudaimonic approach, which is more an objective approach to setting infrastructures for the individual to allow an environment or enable or structure an environment that allows the individual to meet its needs that have to be fulfilled to really be able to develop its capabilities for its well-being. So what we see, this is now taken from the book by Fuchs et al. So needs are understood as something very fixed and very objective, such as participation, belonging, freedom, and autonomy, and they should be met by satisfiers, and these satisfiers, however, are culturally viable. So, and what is very important here is that, or no, first of all, needs are defined as universal driving forces and constitutive aspects of a good life with an indispensable, irreducible, and irreplaceable character. And they are contrasted with the concept of desires. And desires then are understood as kind of subjective wishes. So I quote Fuchs et al. Living a good life within sustainable limits, page 14. So desires are not decisive for the individual's ability to lead a good life. This does not mean that an individual will not enjoy satisfying their desires, only that an inability to satisfy one's desires is no serious impediment to individual flourishing. And against this backdrop, on this distinction between needs and desires, consumption corridors ultimately contain both minimum and maximum standards. So the minimum standards enable each individual, of course, to live a good life, and maximum standards in order to prevent overconsumption so that others cannot live on the expense of others anymore, and therefore guarantee a good life for all within planetary boundaries. And within liberal democracies, it is argued that consumption corridors should be negotiated in mechanisms of participation and deliberation, and then implemented within liberal democracies. And of course, and that is something we found extremely interesting, is the literature initially deals in detail with like the obvious objections that come up when discussing limitation through maximum standards, which is also why this literature was so intriguing also for us to delve then even deeper in the responses that they gave to such obvious objections. For example, as I put the paper by Di Giulia and Fuchs, who have already described certain objections, such as the liberalists' argument and the argument of lacking acceptance. And for them, the liberalists' argument states that the liberal state must not interfere with negative freedoms of its citizens. So the understanding of freedom in liberal democracies is first and foremost defined negatively as the absence from constraints, interferences, and obstacles to one's freedom to make decisions about one's own life. And with regard to this negative concept of freedom, Fuchs et al., so not only Di Giulia and Fuchs have answered to such objections, but also it's also been found in different parts of the literature. And Fuchs et al. Argue, for example, that negative freedoms are only possible through limits. So protecting the freedom of others has always been accepted. And they argue, and I quote, collectively, we embrace limits on individual freedom via formal law or societal norms to protect individuals from each other or to allow the pursuit of communal interests where they conflict with individual ones. And a second answer to the liberalists' argument is, according to Fuchs et al., that refers to their understanding of autonomy, and that actually autonomy as collective self-limitation, which also Brandt et al. Propose in their work on societal boundaries within planetary boundaries, is actually something that has always been a deep understanding of autonomy in liberal thought. They say that taking a different perspective, we may consider self-chosen limits as expressions of freedom. Exercising restraint by imposing rules upon ourselves is the very essence of autonomy. And as I said, they also mention different objections, such as the argument of lacking acceptance. And here they say that no majorities can be found, or this objection says that no majorities can be found for consumption limits. So they answer to that, or they respond to that with regard to the potential lack of acceptance, particularly of maximum standards. We question the empirical foundation of such an argument. In fact, numerous examples of societies democratically agreeing on and accepting such maximum limits exist. Simple examples are alcohol levels when driving or maximum speed limits. And maximum speed limits is also something that we will take up again in what follows. So what we did now is take all of these responses to the objections and try to dig deeper into them. And as I said, we always agreed with the argumentation on the first lens, but then we also added a but to it. So again, the liberalist argument that in liberal democracy, it's always important that individuals protect each other from one another to pacify their different interests. We argue that instead of limiting individual freedoms, social and political conflicts of interest and challenges were actually always pacified through economic growth and democratization of consumption opportunities, which were regarded as universal remedies. So from a political economic perspective, it can be argued that social reconciliation and social satisfaction, so reconciliation of different interests of different parts of society, and also the class conflict, which is structurally embedded, has been sustained since the post-war period through economic growth. So it was actually not, social satisfaction and reconciliation was not created by restricting freedoms of others, but by democratizing consumer freedoms. And it was a common argument in the USA of the 1940s and in Europe of the 1950s that prosperity for all depends on the development of consumer societies, for which the state creates a framework conditions without then further intervening. And as Ludwig Erhard, the famous West German Minister of Economics and architect of the so-called West German economic miracle, has put it, citizens have a basic democratic right to consume, which must find its logical complement in the freedom of the entrepreneur. The freedom of consumption and the freedom of economic entrepreneurship must be anchored in the civic consciousness as inviolable fundamental rights. And so given that negative freedom, as also the literature on consumption corridors has already mentioned as an objective, but then responded to, is actually the way freedom is understood in liberal democracies. In contemporary liberal societies, consumption represents actually kind of the primary sphere in which this negative freedom is exercised. And this also brings us to the second barrier, and that is the lens on autonomy. So as we remember, the liberalist argument 2 was, or the response by Fuchs et al. According to a notion of autonomy in liberal democracies is taking a different perspective, we may consider safe chosen limits as expressions of freedom. Exercising restraint by imposing rules upon ourselves is the very essence of autonomy. And it is true that this, so first of all, we again agree with that, because in liberal political theory, moral autonomy, and also in critical theory, moral autonomy is the ideal of the self-determining individual and subject, the autonomous subject, who bases his action on the categorical imperative and imposes rules and limitations upon itself. And also personal autonomy, since Mill, is the idea of seeking our own good in our own way, as long as we do not intend to deprive others of their freedom. So both ideas of autonomy imply limits to one's self-freedom. So therefore, we very much agree with the literature. But autonomy is also a very variable concept that can change according to what does it actually means to be autonomous and capable of acting for the subjects which are constituted in productive conditions of society. And therefore, we would argue that in contemporary liberal democracies, whose productive conditions are actually shaped by neoliberal governmentality, being able to act autonomously means, first of all, self-realization in the competitive market, for which consumption then again plays a central role. And this came up then actually by building on the rising prosperity and mass consumption of the golden age. Parts of the new social movements of the late 1960s and early 1970s, especially the French student movement, as Boltanski and Chapello have famously described together with the labor movement, called for greater self-realization, called for greater flexibility and self-responsibility, which Boltanski and Chapello describe in short as greater autonomy in one's life and also in one's workplace, beyond, in a form of autonomy that goes beyond the obedience of the masses to hierarchies and authorities. And what the new students, the French student movements together with the labor movement did was actually putting the market in a crisis due to numerous strikes and acts of sabotage. And the response of the neoliberal turn was then actually the co-optation of these demands by the new student movement, of the so-called artistic critique that they articulated according to Romantic thought. And the solution was a disciplining promise of the neoliberal turn. So the demand for the individual to then be more flexible, be more self-responsible, be self-responsible for your own success in the market according to self-realization, but self-realization in neoliberal market terms. So to succeed in neoliberal meritocracy, the subjectified workforce, including my identity, my skills, my character, my appearance, must also be marketed as a unique commodity. And there's especially in culturalized jobs, there's like a need for the performance of uniqueness, which is then also evaluated by an audience of colleagues, of customers, of followers, which very much extends beyond the objective work output of an employee. And that also takes factors like appearance, character, identity, and so on. And Baumann has described this, that the focus of consumption becomes the task of standing out from this gray and flat invisibility, and the consuming subject thus not only reflects their existing identity through consumption, but of course also co-creates it. In short, I have to create and constantly develop my unique self, also in the labor market, and to sell my unique commodity. But then I also need consumption to recover from that, because I'm constantly forced to perform in the productivity imperatives of neoliberal meritocracy. So I also need consumption to recover from that, and also to sustain and also remain resilient as an entrepreneurial self. Yeah, so this, did I, yeah. And then the third barrier that we mentioned is the barrier that we consider the barrier of democratic legitimacy. As I said, the argument of lacking acceptance states that no majorities can be found for consumption limits. And as I said, the answer to this was given by Di Giulio and Fuchs, that they actually doubt this objection, saying numerous examples of societies, or there are numerous examples of societies democratically agreeing on and accepting such maximum limits. And they, for example, mentioned maximum speed limits. And our answer again is yes. So there is setting limits is essential in liberal democracies in order to guarantee the exercise of civil and individual freedoms, starting with the criminal law, but actually actively restricting consumer freedoms poses, the argument, or our argument goes, enormous legitimacy problems for the state, which draws on reification, exclusion, and performance. And this is now an argument made by Daniel Hausknos, which I'm giving to you. So thereby we draw on the concept of passive legitimacy that Daniel Hausknos has recently published, saying that liberal democracies stabilize themselves precisely because the essential components of social reality are generated externally, allowing the state to take on a reactive administrative role. For example, it makes a decisive difference whether consumer prices such as petrol, which we have seen in the Yellow Vest protests in France, rise due to the world market or due to conflicts or due to external conflicts such as the Ukraine war, or due to government decisions that of course require justification. And the functional difference here lies in whether the reality is reified as a fact or whether it is subjectively and deliberately constructed, and thus experienced as something that is contingent and contestable. And setting such consumption corridors would then transfer and thus also politicize essential areas of civil reality from the fear of acceptable factuality to that of contestable expression of will. And actually the introduction or the reduction of speed limits that, as an example that Di Giulio and Fuchs have also mentioned, is maybe an almost, for example, in Germany, an almost invincible political issue that, of course, people from a consumption corridors perspective or from a perspective on a profound social ecological transformation can't really understand why this is such a big thing. And at the same time, market-related prices increasing are just accepted as if it's a weather phenomena. And in addition to reification, Daniel says that exclusion is another essential source of passive legitimacy. By exclusion, one second. This is as exclusion actually refers to work. Also others have been done, such as Lessennich's Externalization Society or the Imperial Mode of Living. So the appropriation of external labor and resources, and the exclusion of those from whom this appropriation takes place, and the outsourcing of the negative consequences of production and consumption processes. So externalization actually stables the internal relations by reducing political conflict potential, because negative aspects of our life world, of our saturated life worlds, are externalized onto those to whom no accountability is owed. So by challenging reification and externalization, consumption corridors would weaken the final pillar of passive legitimacy, and that is performance. So that is that the state provides to its citizen a very saturated life world, including material wealth, security, consumer choice, personal mobility, and all that. And even if governments would offer some level of sustainable welfare, the state would still likely be seen as a creator of constraints, of threats, of imposition onto private life, rather than providers of unlimited opportunities. And those, from this perspective on democratic legitimacy, consumption corridors would undermine essential self-stabilization mechanisms of contemporary liberal democracies. And deliberation would actually do little to change this situation, although unless the results were secured by a plebiscite, and then also this plebiscite would have to be binding, etc. So what we would like to conclude is that against the backdrop of the role of consumption for social reconciliation, late modern autonomy, and democratic legitimacy, we would like to quote Stefanie Grefe, who has put it from a subject theoretical perspective, that whoever are unable or unwilling to name what is awesome, in German it's geil, in the original sense of the word, about the infinite variety of options that the world of goods in advanced capitalism offers to solvent buyers, will hardly be able to understand why people always demand more goods, better goods, more individual goods, and those actively reproduce growth on a daily basis. And against this backdrop, we argue that currently, in times of real growth weaknesses and distributional conflicts that we are seeing, the idea of consumption corridors is actually being called into question by two more successful narratives that take the overarching priority of economic growth and its ties to legitimacy, satisfaction, reconciliation, and autonomy more serious, or just fulfill these ties. And this is, as Reitz and Jörge have described, on the one hand, the cosmopolitan universalist camp. One can discuss about whether the name universalist really fits here. Seeks to revive economic growth and its function of social pacification through ecological modernization, and the nationalist exclusionary camp, as they put it, which selectively propagates economic growth and its social pacification mechanisms in a more traditional fossilistic way, for the in-group, at the expense of others, at the expense of migrants, at the expense of enlightenment norms. So we would argue that within liberal democracies, consumption corridors may maybe serve as a tool for managing conditions of scarcity, which could result from escalating climate crisis, for example, in which this kind of scarcity would then be more perceived as an objective rather than politically imposed by the state. And in fact, scarcity may thus be maybe a functional precondition for CCs, consumption corridors to become more acceptable, more so than defining CCs through deliberation. And as a political instrument for good life for all within ecological limits, we suggest that CCs would, in our opinion, require a different social context, for example, Republican democracy, or it would actually lead to a kind of democratic socialism, for which we currently do not really see many directions, so societal directions pointing there. So maybe this is a bit a pessimistic take, but I'm very interested in your thoughts and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karoline, for your talk. I'm still thinking about your last slides and the conclusions, because I think you have a really interesting take looking at a political theory approach on freedom and moral autonomy and what constitutes a good life within liberal democracies. So thank you very much for that. I think we have some time for questions and answers at this stage. I have a few questions, but maybe I'm not going to be the one to start. So just to open the floor to questions. I know that most of us are working on similar concepts, so I'm sure you will get interesting perspectives to develop your work as well. So maybe we can open the floor now for questions, and I'll, in the meantime, I'll also elaborate my thoughts on my notes. Magnus, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Karoline. I enjoyed your talk very much. I think it was a nice presentation and very good arguments. I agree with the scarcity argument, the last comment. I think that is probably more a realistic path towards corridors, imposing corridors within our societies. When I listen to you, I wonder about a couple of things. One is inequalities. Well, you kind of touched that with the third barrier and the colonialist things, etc. But I wonder, are inequalities in our societies, like in Germany or Sweden, etc.? What do you think? Is that barrier, or is it? I can think of. I mean, it's part of the consumption corridor itself to have to have bottom and maximum, so to say. So it's. I mean, there is an inequality dimension in it. So could this be a facilitator to, I mean, target those who are very rich for and I mean to create legitimacy for these kind of policies? Or could it be that when you are poor, you just want to get more so that you are having the same amount of stuff and income on consumption possibilities like the rich one? So I mean, I could imagine both possibilities and the limit. And one more question I had when I listened to you, I mean, the liberal frame the liberal democracy. It's in my head a lot about the individual versus the state, and in between there is the whole community social dimension of everything, so to say. And also I wonder how the social, well, that is things that I've done myself a lot as a sociologist, and thinking about the social. I mean, that kind of is a bit lacking in the argument, maybe. And I think at the dimension of the social, our social networks, our relationships, etc., could also go in both direction as opening up for consumption corridors thinking, but also prevent. I mean, because we are consumerism is also related to the social drivers in relationships. But there are also many examples, empirical examples of groups in the community level that actually try to, I mean, it's not the only the individual who tries to as the references to limit yourself, but you do this in communities. I mean, sharing, share resources and like that, and yeah, all those different things. Movements in cities. So those were a few things that I was thinking about, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah. Do you want to collect questions, or should I just answer straight away?
I think you can answer if you want. We're a small group, so we can keep it informal.
Yeah, I think we have time. Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Magnus. Yeah, about the social, I'm not sure I really have an answer about your second question about the social networks, groups, and community level. Of course, they are sharing practices, and they are sharing communities, and they're like, repair cafes and all these kind of, ways of prefigured a more sustainable everyday practices. This is there, of course, but I do not really see a way of such more sustainable groups and communities to really, rise up as on a higher societal level, to really build up the infrastructure that is needed. If I got you right, maybe I also didn't fully understand your question. But I think that may also relate to my second question, because I do think that infrastructure that helps, as you said, those who suffer from the inequalities that are embedded not just globally, but of course also within each Western society, as you mentioned, in Germany and in Sweden. Of course, there are those who suffer from social inequalities who are on the lower social strata. And I also think that addressing these people would be like the biggest strategy that we currently have in order to try to gain majorities and try to gain their support, and trying to make them understand that it is not something that we want to take away from them, or it's not a threat or an imposition. And I think this is also something how it is perceived a lot, but something as an offer, and also as a form of rising equality, and an offer to improve their saturated life world. But I think at this point, also for example, environmental sociology has to reflect upon its own kind of language, and upon the way maybe it, I don't know, addresses those kind of parts of the population that we actually need for a majority. Because otherwise, I think what we currently observe is that there's kind of a coalition between, on the one hand, parts of the population trying to really defend their everyday life and their life world by being afraid of losing the material well-being, and also being afraid of losing at least the opportunity to get there and the promise of getting there. Also, they didn't even get there yet. However, I think this very neoliberal promise, which is not just in disciplinary demand, but also a very promise you will achieve it, you will get there, you will get your own self-realization through your own hard work is also something that is very deeply, you know, subjectified in the people. So that's really hard to get out of there. So, but yeah, I think trying to address social inequalities is something that is like the most important social the most important strategy for attempts to achieve a more profound social ecological transformation. But then again, also if we look at how different milieus, even only the use of language, I think can already be a barrier. Like, for example, talking about using gendered language can already cause such a huge distinction between groups in society that I think it's really a question of how can you approach them with a different habitus than maybe the ones that, you know, the scientific cosmopolite urban community has. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question fully, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree a lot to what you're saying. I can come back later when with some follow-up, but please let others speak first.
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Magnus. And Sarah, I think you had your hands up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Karoline. I really enjoyed listening to you, but also reading your paper. I am still thinking about my comment because I need some time to better elaborate on that. But when we are talking about consumption corridors, and I was listening to you, and sometimes I also think about that maybe that what can be the main reason that many people are very defensive against consumption corridors. And after listening to you and, you know, some reflection, maybe instead of consumption corridors, if we call it practice corridors, it includes not only people, but also, you know, the bigger society. Because when we talk about consumption corridors, the first things, even when I read consumption corridors, come to my mind is that, okay, most of the responsibility is on individuals. Yeah. But when we call it practice corridors, I'm not sure, I'm still thinking, but we can maybe you have also thought about it. Then it gives a bigger perspective. Okay, infrastructures should be changed. It is not that we have as individuals should change our lifestyles, but also, you know, our practices in societal level should be changed, and then we need institutions to help us, and then we don't find ourselves in the room that we are the only who should take the responsibility. Have you thought about it, or do you want to share something about it?
Well, I have not much thought about it, but I've just thought about it recently by writing an application for a job. So yes, I also think that although the literature on consumption corridors is definitely not something that is that follows an individualist methodological individualist approach of consumption that says that the individual has all the responsibility. Especially it is about infrastructures, the way I understand it. I mean, I'm not a proponent of the consumption corridors literature, but I understand it as something that is very much in favor of trying to give infrastructure, and that could, as you just said, be described as a practice corridor. Maybe that would really help, because I also think that the way the language is used is not really something that how you get the people, because of course consumption corridors and limiting the consumption of people and also saying your desires are not really legit, but what we really have to fulfill are the needs, but your subjective wishes do not really count. I think that is something that is kind of problematic there. But this is just the question of how do we get majorities, and then the other question is how do you get like political, on the political level, how do you get this really being implemented? And I think this is another problem. Because I also think that if infrastructure was about to change and communicated in a way, and maybe even developed in a way that is also together with people who are against a profound social ecological transformation in the first place, and sitting together with these people, I do think that this might have an impact on, and of course, this is something that consumption corridor literature also describes. So yeah, then I'm also turning myself into circuits, of course, because on the one hand, I'm considering, I really like the proposal. On the other hand, one is considering like the structural barriers of it. And then if you think again, okay, but what would be a possible solution? You find yourself at the, at the end of what you've just criticized, or not criticized, but constructively tried to unpack. So that is, I think it's a really difficult way out. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can discuss it more later. I mean, maybe over some chats later. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, feel free to follow up.
Yeah, if someone else is not. Yeah, it's interesting to, follow up on Sarah's question about practice corridors. It's interesting to think upon limits, because that's what it is, and how to frame limits. Is there other ways than consumption corridors? Many people are aware of overconsumption, of high climate footprints, of high ecological footprints, and it requires more planets than we have to sustain. So, I believe there are legitimacy for regulation, but the question is how. Should it target like consumption directly or through other means? One other path is work. And I think there is quite strong legitimacy to reduce work hours, for example, and that's another pathway to which would target consumption indirectly, because if you work less, then we will earn less, etc. So so that could be interesting. How, what are the different paths to limits, and what are the possibility, legitimacy, etc. On the other hand, one fine thing with consumption corridor is that if it is provocative, maybe that's a good thing, because then people are forced to reflect about things if we are suddenly talking about those kind of things. On the other hand, politicians want they're afraid of those, as you are showing in your presentation, and they don't pick up those words because they won't be elected.
So. Yeah. And I'm not sure whether thinking about being provocative, whether that is a good thing. If we look at the political constellation in the moment, and at the defensive reactive parts of the far right, I'm not too sure whether being provocative is still something in this kind of way that is still working. So I really think that different ways of communication and trying to work out together how inequality can be addressed is something that would be not provocative, but trying to avoid that people feel threatened and imposed by the people up there, including the epistemic elites, which we belong to the epistemic elites, and I think this is a huge step that has to be overcome communication wise. Maybe even organizing would be a way, and sending people from door to door who do not have the same habitus as scientists from the cosmopolitan urban epistemic elites, just very basic as it is.
I agree with this dilemma, but sometimes there is this radical flank effect, which use stretching the perspectives, and the consumption corridor can be like that, which other groups pick up, but reframe in a more, less provocative way, so to say. So it can, I mean, a radical concept can open up for softer concepts.
Yeah, just building on these last remarks of the epistemic elite and how to bridge the communication barriers. I wanted to go back to the initial point about needs and desires, and I guess my question is about how do we shift the narrative and create a different narrative where not all the needs are addressed through the market. So I really liked what you said about the neoliberal promise, and when you said we are forced to consume to perform the uniqueness of our entrepreneurial self, and then we're also forced to consume to recover from the effort and the striving for such performance, and that's where all the self-care industry is burgeoning now. So this is, I totally agree, the neoliberal promise is unfulfilled and not broken by design. So I guess my question is, there is so much knowledge in happiness studies and also psychology, looking at the fulfillment of needs that are communal, shared, and not based on market possessions. So how do we shift the conversation more towards the sufficiency element of the polarity, right? Because I totally agree with what you said about scarcity, and if policymakers should frame the upper limits of consumption around scarcity, then they're more likely to get accepted. And I totally agree with the pragmatic premises of this argument. But my question is, can we, and if so, how do we shift the conversation more towards the sufficiency elements of this question, and how to address needs not through market desires, but through communal living and those aspects of life that we know through psychology and happiness studies that actually fulfill basic human needs. It's a very scattered question, but just pulling together different reflections that was coming to my mind while you were speaking. So I don't know if I conveyed an actual question.
Well, I think this is like the $1 million question that you're asking, and I would love to have an answer to that. But I think, I mean, there are loads of scientists sitting here that have way more experience than I do. But yeah, of course, I mean, as I said, there are initiatives that, try to fulfill needs not through market mechanisms. For example, new ways of housing, new way of building a community in different ways of housing, of living together, having a community, trying to, fulfill your daily needs. But even there's kind of critique on it, for example, on the community capitalism, saying that this is actually also just something that the neoliberal state then draws on the communities who are trying to take care of themselves, but the state does not have to do it. So it's also something that reinforces kind of the neoliberal logic of the individual is self-responsible for its own happiness, and then the individual is self-responsible for its own happiness in the community that it self-organizes. So again, the question is, do we want the state to be someone who is actually giving the infrastructure needed for well-being, both on an individual and then also a collective level? Then I'm not sure whether private initiatives of communities are sufficient. And I think this is a huge problem, that we always like try things and try to figure out new ways of doing it, and then at the end, well, yeah, we have we are again stuck in this neoliberal idea of I do it myself. Yeah, so I think like what is actually needed is a huge politicization on more social welfare mechanisms given by the state, and but again, in a way that does not say we want to take something away, but we are giving something from you, and not, but through infrastructure that then could you know, lead to long-term changes in practices, and maybe also to then later exnovation once infrastructure has been built. But I cannot, of course, like tax I cannot tax gasoline for cars before having implemented the infrastructure needed for people living on the countryside, you know, taking the bus. So exnovation is, of course, something that is then also very important, and that could be seen as maximum limits of consumption. But I think it would be something that is framed differently, and is also taking one step after the other. First of all, providing the infrastructure, and then the exnovation who takes things out. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with the need to politicize social welfare themes, and yeah, they need to be central when it comes to infrastructure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
and I mean, such attempts are still framed within liberal democracy, which is framed within capitalist democracy, and actually, or at least my goal would be to get out of that, but I don't really see it. So even having a social welfare state would be nice. And I think this is such a small step, and it's such a small goal, which already seems so far away. Yeah. Or just speed limits seem so far away.
Thank you, Karoline. I'm just checking out. I don't know if we have any other questions. If not, we can gently wrap up for today. You've certainly gave us a lot to think about, and what is socially acceptable when it comes to legitimacy from a state perspective. So yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the talk, and yeah, I'm just looking around. If there are no other questions, then we can wrap up for today. We have another seminar coming up only in 2 weeks. Actually, it will be 14th of May, and I think we have the invitation, but we can circulate them more broadly. I'll circulate with you as well, Karoline, if you'd like to be kept in the loop and come to the other seminars. So yeah, I think that we can wrap up for today. Thank you all so much for attending and for the fantastic discussion. Oh, Magnus, we have no, it was a mistake. It was a reaction. Okay, thank you so much all. It was great to see you all, and I wish you a lovely rest of your evening. Thank you so much, Karoline, for taking the time to come present your research, and we'll be in touch, and we'll hope to see you to the next seminars as well. Yeah. Thank you again.
Thank you, Karoline.
Great to see you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.